Hi there, and welcome to Ian's Engage channel. I'm Ian. In a previous video I showed how I basically demolished Shelfington in order to make the changes necessary to future-proof the layout. In this video I'm going to show how I began to rebuild the layout. So, once I'd stripped Shelfington back to the bare basics, it gave me a chance to fix an error I'd made when laying the bottom layer of foam. I'd put down some 20mm thick rectangular foam tiles, and being the cheapskate that I am, had spaced them out so I didn't have to use so many of them. I had no way of knowing, but doing this became a big problem when trying to push dropper wires through the layer of foam on top, and then through the plywood baseboard. This was because the gap left between the two layers of foam formed a cavity that the dropper wires seemed to gravitate towards, and disappeared into, instead of going through the hole I'd drilled. The first time this happened, I simply couldn't work out what was happening, and thought I'd constructed a portal into another dimension, where my dropper wires must be mysteriously appearing. Thankfully, I eventually worked out what was going on, so filling in the gaps was a must while I had everything dismantled. To fill the gaps, I started out measuring the size of the gap using a piece of paper as a sort of template. This was important as the gaps weren't completely rectangular, and I wanted the inserts to be as tight-fitting as possible. Next, I marked up a new piece of foam to the correct length. Then I used my utility knife to cut it to size. The next job was to use the paper template to mark the correct width for the foam insert. The utility knife was used again to cut the foam. If the foam insert was too tight, I used an emery board to sand down the edges until it had a satisfactory fit. I then vacuumed out the gap before adding Gorilla Wood glue, which I spread thinly around the gap. Now the foam insert could be inserted. Here I'm using a wooden box to ensure that the adjacent foam pieces are all level and none are sticking up above the surface. Finally, I used something heavy like a couple of 1-2-3 blocks to weigh the foam insert down until the glue dried. On a couple of occasions it wasn't necessary to use the paper template as the gaps were rectangular, so I could simply measure them before performing the cut. But the paper template method would still have worked. Ideally, instead of filling the gaps, I would have replaced the 20mm thick foam rectangles with larger sheets of 40mm thick foam, but the Gorilla Wood glue I'd used to secure the foam in the first place to the plywood had done an excellent job, so the pieces of foam were going nowhere. So, after filling in the gaps, I decided to place an extra 20mm thick piece of foam on top of the original 20mm to bring the base level up to 40mm. This would be the ideal height for installing my micro servo motors, and would also allow me to dig into it to provide undulating landscape features away from the track work. Thankfully, I had plenty of 20mm thick foam sheets to get on with the job. So it was a simple matter of marking the sheets of foam using a pencil, scoring them using a utility knife, and then snapping them along the score line. I needed 3 sheets to get Shelfington into a state where I'd be able to lay a loop of track for some testing. I finished up by temporarily pinning each of the new pieces of foam to the base layer in order to keep it in place while I considered how I was going to transition from the 40mm base level to the 60mm level at the rear of the layout. Now, The eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed another problem. If you spotted it, well done. For those that didn't, the problem area is in front of the 3-foot baseboard, which used to extend out to meet the front of the 6-foot baseboard. This had been achieved using a piece of 40mm thick foam, which had been rigid enough to remain flat. However, if I left things as they were, at this point there'd only be 20mm of foam, which was nowhere near thick enough to remain flat, so I'd need something to support the foam beneath the overhang. However, that sounds like a subject for another video, so I guess this is a good point to stop for now. Okay, so this may not have been the most exciting of updates, but I think it was quite an important one, as it means that the rebuilding of Shelfington has begun. The loop of track I intend to lay for further testing will also allow me to film footage for a few local reviews I intend to write in the coming weeks. Of course, it will also allow me to play trains again, which is excellent news. Right, that just leaves me to say that if you've got any hints, tips, useful tools or techniques to pass on to a beginner in N-gauge modelling, or if you simply want to say hello, then please do so in the comments section. Anything and everything you've got to say will be greatly appreciated. In the meantime, thanks ever so much for watching. Hopefully I'll have another update on my progress soon. Bye.